Well, most of the media coverage that we're privy to about Africa portrays Africa as a place of darkness, despair, disease, conflict, savagery in many respects. Somewhat of a flip side of that, we also hear a lot about how we have to save Africa. Or we see lots of stories about movie stars saving Africa. Well, I would like to suggest that we stop trying to, or even thinking that we should save Africa, and instead start learning from Africa. That motivation has been, for me, it's been a big part behind my work with a program called Fambul Tok that I've had the privilege of helping to bring into being over the last 4 years. Fambul Tok means family talk in Krio. And it's based in Sierra Leone in West Africa. And unlike the stories that we hear in most Western media, it is an incredible story of courage and compassion and individual redemption and forgiveness and collective rebirth and renewal. I have learned so much from being a part of this and witnessing these stories, and I'm so excited to be able to share them with you today. Before I start and tell you a little bit about some of what's happening with Fambul Tok, I thought it would be helpful to get a little bit of background so you know the context that it's emerging within. First of all, where is Sierra Leone? It's in West Africa, that little red dot. It's about the size of the state of Illinois. 6 million people live there currently. It's bordered by Guinea and Liberia. And if any of you saw the movie Blood Diamonds, you know about Sierra Leone's civil war. They had an 11-year civil war that was one of the most brutal in history. And there's been a long series, unfortunately, of brutal wars in Africa, and Sierra Leone set a new standard of brutality in many ways. Known for mass amputations, child soldiers, rape as a tool of war, and scorched earth tactics of destruction of whole villages. This is the slaughterhouse in Kailaun where many of the mass murders in the war took place in Kailaun district. One of the, some of the statistics from the war, 50,000 people died. There were 10,000, over 10,000 child soldiers. Tens of thousands of women were raped in that war. 2 million people were displaced. They lost their homes in the destruction of their villages. The war ended officially in 2002, and there's been some significant efforts in the international community to help rebuild and to help the Sierra Leonean citizens feel some measure of justice after the atrocities of the war and begin a process of reconciliation. The two major initiatives have been a special court, which is a hybrid of both by the Sierra Leonean government and the United Nations. And the special court has prosecuted, or rather indicted, 13 men, those that they deem to be most responsible for the war. They've convicted 8, a few of them died while they were in custody. One trial, the Charles Taylor trial, is still going on. And the head of the United Nations in Sierra Leone estimates that the cost of the special court has been over $500 million. Most Sierra Leoneans feel that it did nothing to bring them justice. However, there was also a Truth and Reconciliation Commission modeled after South Africa's, and that ran from 2002 to 2004. The problem with that is that they held hearings and gave people the opportunity to come and tell their stories of what happened to them during the war. They held those hearings in the capital cities of the country and of the districts in Sierra Leone. And they were very short periods of time. So the ordinary Sierra Leonean couldn't, had no access to them. Now, civil war is commonly the people most impacted by civil war are ordinary people themselves. And so ordinary people in Sierra Leone felt that they had no access to justice, that the major international community's mechanisms for bringing justice did not, in fact, do it for them. So what would justice look like to your ordinary Sierra Leonean? Who would be involved? Where would it take place? Well, John Cocker, who is a longtime Sierra Leonean human rights activist and was actually a leader of the Civil Society Advisory Group to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He had the novel idea that if you wanted to have a justice and reconciliation mechanism that actually met the needs of ordinary people and wanted to find out what that should be, you should ask them. What a concept. Ask people. First of all, do you want to reconcile? Second of all, what would that look like? What resources do you have for doing it? And in the case of Fambul Tok, how can we help with that? Now, the answers that came from the consultation with citizens all across the country were that for them, what justice would look like is, first of all, it had to take place in places that they could reach, that they had access to in their communities, in places that were comfortable and accessible. The idea emerged that it needed to be around a bonfire. This is a common tradition in Sierra Leone of coming together at the end of the day and talking around the bonfire and sharing news of the day and solving conflicts. And so they wanted it around bonfires. They wanted it to draw on their culture and their tradition and not be imposed from the outside. And the other thing that they wanted is that it needed to have three components. It needed to be, to include an honest acknowledgement of what happened, of what you did, an acknowledgement of the crimes committed. It needed to include apology, and it needed to include forgiveness. Those were the elements that went into designing Fambul Tok. And something extraordinary is possible when you ask ordinary people what they want and help them to build it. And as this is unfolded across the country, there have been now hundreds of Fambul Tok bonfires, and I'm going to take you into one of them.
Ya coba ho, berapa? Ya berapa? Coba di London nampum. Maka biaya yang dulu, memang puas heki, maka biaya yang dulu ni. Asalnya no tu. Madu mula, ayah bimai, medisinya no. Ya ber, memang no muat heki, memang ayah no ale. Memang jangan pelawarung, do, macam do. Memang du mundo, ame poho di mana ali, ame biyo pandio.
Để dùng cho tôi sao còn mu, iba bo yang do, monewa bo. Yupa da mayula yupa di uko, ati ya tu sali, aja boleh piero, ya pun tu sali, abe itu sako.
Apa mecano sunam peluku. Oke wajar nanti. Kau iya kondo. Dukau indah kau loyan inveni. Loyan sunam. Oh bukan. Ukuran ikon kau. Ikon mana oleh? Mikeng. Pulang nano. Pulang mana ya? Pulang. Mampu. Pulang nano.
Ni menyo. Man.
Matia muai maya di finyaro.
Dia ne forcé pour qu'il pas.
Ya be mi kialu finyaro bura.
C'est qui pas.
Okon koli.
At that time,
Maya go hoda ye maya long.
give me mandate for say for bitter.
Ya be mi cha yom lo mi luan lopla.
This is a tactic a bitter.
So oyatsa kondo.
What thing I don't do,
Ojo he na nile.
not to eat on your own,
O mala kiale.
to make them hack for us.
Am andu haki.
Emang do haki. Menda hening hau, amungun diom play, ya baikkan.
Truthfully, myself, I don't accept to forgive you.
Fair. Layu.
Meda inje. Ben susu dia kila manando e. Ni chanu bodi mya domalaki. Omalaki bele ya to sandu. Le ya be point.
Mẹ nhà hiện nay, Fambul Tok, mẹ mungu diom do play. Kani, visio yang do ni bo Fambul mu na chiu suele. Jangan mana chiu do mun nam suele. Emando.
somewhat unbelievable. But one thing you should know is that now Sar and Yuma are best friends again, and that Yuma has built a house for Sar, the first time he's ever lived in a house with a tin roof. Yuma farms for Sar because Sar's not fully able to do it himself. So that reconciliation has been permanent. And in fact, now that the movie's been released, they see themselves as teachers and eagerly take that role, showing other people what's possible in their country and in their culture and in their community. In many respects, what you're seeing is just a small piece of it, and it happens so fast. It's very difficult, I find, for the Western mind to comprehend. And individually, every time I see that story, I think, oh my gosh, A, how is that possible? Still, I ask myself that question. And B, could I do that? Okay, every time I see that. But one of the things that I've observed in Sierra Leone and that I've learned about Sierra Leone culture is that they have this understanding that when something wrong happens, a crime, it isn't just the individual that's violated, it's the community. And they believe that in order to repair the wrong, the community has to be made whole again. That's what justice means, the community being made whole again. And that can happen until, that includes rather both the victim and the perpetrator. So you can't punish and separate out the perpetrator because then the community still is not whole. So that's very much a part of their concept. The other thing that comes into play in their culture is that almost the worst loss of face that you can have is to admit publicly in front of your community what you did wrong. There is no greater source of shame. So for them, that is real punishment, and they don't want to have to face that again. But there's an interesting interplay between the individual and the community. The community is clearly there. This wouldn't have happened outside of the community context. That's what enabled Sar to feel comfortable coming forward to tell his story. That's what enabled Yuma, even though he was clearly uncomfortable, to be willing to come forward and tell his story. And then after the story ends, the community is there to support their ongoing relationship building. So the individual's transformation contributes to the community's being made whole again. The community is there to support the individual's healing. It's an extraordinary interplay there. But one of the other things that you need to know is that that bonfire didn't happen overnight. The Fambul Tok process, there's about 3 or 4 months of work that happens leading up to a bonfire ceremony, and then at least another year of activities follow up afterwards. But the very first step in any Fambul Tok process is consultation. There's a small national staff, and they go in at the district level, and the first thing they do is gather the stakeholders and say, how do you want to do it? And they help identify individuals from those communities, a couple to be the paid staff, because they're always from that local community. And then so the volunteer executive that coordinates. Those people are trained, and then they go out and they identify the communities in their district and identify groups to lead the process there, reconciliation committees and outreach teams, and then they're trained. And then they, in turn, work with the communities to prepare for the bonfire. So the communities are making the decisions themselves. They're doing the planning themselves. They're designing it to be the way they want it to be. They're bringing the resources. They own it, and that's the whole idea of Fambul Tok. Ownership. The communities own the process. They lead it themselves, and the Fambul Tok process is just about facilitating it. So from those consultations, those are where the ideas came from for what Fambul Tok should look like. And the process of preparing for the ceremony and preparing the community is as much a key part of reconciliation. That is what knits together the social fabric of those communities again. It isn't just about the individuals who are carrying around these huge mental weights, lifting them off. It's about reknitting the communities again, and it's that long-term process that actually does it. Now, Sierra Leone is divided up into, as I said earlier, 14 districts. They're like counties here. And the process of actually working with the communities to design, own, and lead their process, you can't do that from the capital city. You have to go to those places, and that's Fambul Tok's core value. We go to and we walk with. We don't come in from the outside as the experts and say, well, we know how to do it. This is how you're going to do it, or worse yet, do it for them. You're facilitating that process. That takes an awful lot of what we call going to and walking with. And I just want to illuminate for you a little bit of what going to and walking with in this context looks like. It looks like SUVs over roads that are more pothole than roads. Or it looks like staff and volunteers walking. A lot of these communities don't even have roads. So you're walking down footpaths to get there. A lot of the rivers don't have bridges, so you're taking that's a pole ferry that you're taking across. And a lot of the work has to be done on motorcycles because the roads are too bad, even for cars in a lot of the places. That's what it looks like to go to and walk with. So when you ask Sierra Leoneans what they want their ceremony to look like, almost the first thing that they always say is, it needs to include our culture. That's what helps them feel that they own it. This is a cultural dance. Almost every Fambul Tok ceremony begins with a cultural dance, or several, that's bringing the community together to celebrate. Dancing and singing and eating are common, I think, across Africa as parts of community gatherings. The bonfire ceremonies themselves, you don't know in advance who's going to come forward. It's not planned. It's not scripted. Saranyuma, we didn't know that they were going to come forward. It just happened. You prepare the space, and whoever comes forward comes forward. The day after, there's a cleansing ceremony. And again, this is drawing on Sierra Leone's traditions. And here, there's a shaman that has dipped branches in water and is sort of symbolically cleansing, baptizing. That's actually Saranyuma there, and the other testifiers. And they'll go around and cleanse the places in the community where there was a mass rape or where something was burned down. And so it's very much of a spiritual process for them also. The ceremonies also include praying to the ancestors, which is another common practice in Sierra Leone. And they include going to a sacred space, which will be different in every community, where you ask the ancestors' blessing on your work. And of course, the feast that ends the ceremony and enables people to come together, and celebrate, and that they are, in fact, one community. Now, I mentioned that there's a whole series of follow-up activities after the bonfire ceremony. One of the first is that the communities identify a peace tree, a place to gather so that they can come together and talk as new problems arise after a reconciliation ceremony. Because in so many respects, and this is what the staff and the community members say, that apology that you saw for Saranyuma, that's not the end. It's the beginning. And so the vehicles for coming together in an ongoing way afterwards are so important to deepen and sustain the process of reconciliation and the community's ability to work together. So these peace trees are critical, and a lot of ongoing activities happen underneath them. They have soccer matches where victims and perpetrators play together side by side. And it helps, like nothing else, really, to normalize relations. Here's one soccer match. And by the way, this is particularly helpful for the youth. They love the soccer matches. Community farms. That was a practice that was common in Sierra Leone before the war. Villagers come together, they find a piece of, get a chief to donate land, and they pool resources, and they farm together and harvest together and decide together what to do with any profits from their harvest. And it cements the collective decision-making process that's really about democracy with a little d, where they're practicing figuring things out together. And it's tremendously empowering, not to mention it helps meet a critical economic need. Peace Mothers groups, they are forming farms and other activities largely for the benefit of their community. And because they need a place to come together as women. Women suffered uniquely in the war, and they've told us repeatedly that they just want a space to be together as women. However, what happens when they get together is an unbelievable unleashing of energy, and what the Peace Mothers are able to do and have done for their communities is just astonishing. Now, in Sierra Leone, the Fambul Tok process has been going for about 3.5 years. And in that time, there have been, I think as of August, 117 bonfires, at which 1,800 people have testified to over 55,000 of their neighbors. So that's in 3.5 years. Yeah. Really quickly, I just want to illuminate for you how Fambul Tok's having an impact even outside of war-torn Africa, in places a little more like our own. Jump with me to Philadelphia. This is the Philadelphia School, an independent preschool through 8th grade in Philadelphia, and I gave a talk there about Fambul Tok to a group of 6th graders. asked them what they thought justice looked like, for example. They drew pictures of a gavel and the scales, and then we looked at the Sierra Leoneans' answer to what justice looks like, and they were sort of shocked. And one student's comment was, "Oh, gosh, kids can do that too." Anyway, we had a great conversation. I didn't think too much more about it, but I found out a couple weeks later that just a few days after I had been there, these students had gone out on their weekly field trip, and there had been a disruptive incident, and one student had ended up slapping another student. Well, instead of sending that student off to the teachers, they decided they were going to sit down in a circle under a tree and talk it through, which they did. And one little boy stood up and said, "Hey, we just had our own Fambul Tok." And that wasn't it. I mean, they had been plagued all year long with instances of bullying, disrespect of each other and the teachers. It just was a very difficult learning environment. And so the teachers said, "We're going to have our own classroom Fambul Tok," and they sat everyone down in a circle and laid the ground rules. 3.5 hours later, everyone had spoken. Almost everyone had cried, and they described it as the most transforming learning experience they'd ever had. These are other people's stories, but in so many ways there are stories too. And we're all writing the stories of our lives, is the way I look at it. And we can choose to write stories of the restoration of relationship, and of the rebirth of communities, and of individual dignity being restored. We can choose to write those stories, and I want to end by just inviting us to make that choice, inviting us all to continue to be inspired by these stories, to look at our own lives differently, to ask who we can forgive, who we need to forgive, who we need to apologize to, because sometimes that's often harder, and to look at our communities and say, how well do our communities help us to deal with conflict constructively? How can they do it better? And then most importantly, what can I do to help make that happen? Thank you.